Okay, we all right?
Yeah.
Right. Okie dokie. Get rid of that sign. Okie dokie. Right. So, hello everyone. We're finally on week 5, which is the fourth one of the topics. And we're trying to look at this question of can we actually follow Jesus today? I'm hoping that's moved. And we began the first week by looking at a method. And then we were asking the question, has the church followed Jesus and the New Testament? And when we looked at war and violence, we said the answer was pretty much no, not after Constantine got his vision to conquer in the sign of the cross. With life, we found that the church's history of healthcare and so on was extremely good, but we didn't understand why these days everybody seemed to think it was all just about being anti-abortion or anti-stem cell research or anti-assisted dying. And then last week we looked at money, and that was a fairly resounding no, the church hasn't followed Jesus's teachings on that. And so today we're going to come to the whole difficult topic of sexuality. And then next week we'll be doing some summary of it and a chance to bring some questions. I'm just going to say to Gary that I know Gary's still got some books he wants to get rid of, and so I've suggested that if necessary we bring the prices down because Gary doesn't want to end up with books left over. So if you want to buy a book off Gary, you can either do it on the previous price or $20 for the other two and $10 for John because obviously he needs to get rid of them. So the current arguments over human sexuality, which include marriage and divorce, gender issues, transgender issues, homosexuality, all of those things. I love this picture, why being Pope means never having to say you're sorry, which is about all the sex scandals, not just in the Roman Catholic Church, but of course across many of the churches. And there's been a massive debate now that was going on for the last 2 or 3 decades between and among those who want to be biblical or claim to be biblical and who want to do what the Bible says with these various labels, the conservatives against the liberals or the traditionalists against those who want to be inclusive. And just to give you a flavour of this, just 2 groups that are operating across the Anglican Communion. Anglican Mainstream, which, as you can see, says Anglo-Catholic, Evangelical, Orthodox, Charismatic, and Mainstream. Very much the traditionalists. And it claims that faithfulness to Scripture as God's Word is essential for sharing the love and purpose of God in Jesus Christ. Whereas on the other side, you've got the Inclusive Church Net, and they again both say the vision can and must be rooted in the Scriptures. So actually both sides are appealing to the same Scriptures, the Bible. And you know these slides well, but just to remind ourselves of why we're doing what we're doing, the conversation I had with John Cleese and Terry Jones about Jesus as a moral teacher and the New Testament as a book of moral ethical teaching, and that I've said there are problems with that, and that's why I wanted to use this biographical approach that comes out of my Gospels work, and that's why I got the Ratzinger Prize, because of the connection of Jesus and the Gospels. Wanting to follow Jesus has been behind everything I've done. And so the project, Imitating Jesus, and then the second volume, Following Jesus, until Matthew renamed it Money, Sex, Power, Violence, the Meaning of Life, takes Jesus seriously as a preacher of restoration eschatology, the idea that God is going to restore the kingdom at the end, the eschaton of all things. And therefore Jesus' moral teaching is part of his preaching of the kingdom of God. And the difference that this gives us immediately is that it enables us to look at Jesus' ethical teaching and his practice, that so much New Testament ethics has traditionally just looked at his teachings, whereas the whole point about biography in the ancient world was it was words and deeds. So that gives us his commands, but also the narrative. And this is going to be really important in this topic, as it has been in the others, of this narrative approach. and that we've been using that as a way of getting over the gap, the bridge between the first century and our world today. And the point that we've said, but it's still worth stressing, we can't start out and ask the first century text our 21st century questions. So if you ask the question, as we showed last week, what do you do about global debt? We couldn't get an answer to that from the scriptures. If you ask the scriptures, what should we do about gay marriage? Again, you can't get any of that. But if we look at this topic of looking at these topics that have been crucial in all areas of human endeavor over down through history and across the globe, like money and sexuality and violence and power and the meaning or value of human life, we saw that those are the things that actually all societies have done ethics and taboos and laws about. And this helps us therefore get over both the cultural gap and the issue about the contingency of issues. And you should be now fairly familiar with this fourfold method, and I've said a number of times that my experience is it's quite difficult for people to grapple with it the first time through, but once you've been through it several times, so I'm hoping by now the idea of moving from the descriptive task, beginning with Jesus' words and deeds, particularly looking at the triple tradition, i.e. the stuff in Matthew, Mark and Luke, using our historical tools, and looking at what Jesus' teachings were, but also his example and the narrative. And then moving into the canonical task, where we were doing a proper exegesis, bringing out of the meaning of the text, grappling with the tensions and looking for the best line fit, and the question of whether Paul and the rest of the New Testament follow Jesus' direction of travel or not. And then the interpretive task was a way of being able to look at all these texts in a different way. One was obviously to follow them through from Jesus to the rest of the New Testament. The other is to look at them in their different four subgenres of commands and principles and so on. And then we come to the practical task. We're saying, okay, now we've got these verses. How do we actually go about interpreting it? So a quick word of background, as we've done with most topics, where we began with something about the topic in the ancient world. It is worth remembering that Judaism was a patriarchal society, even though Jewishness came down the matriarchal line, i.e. you were Jewish if you have a Jewish mother, but women were separated in the synagogue and the temple, to the side or at the back. Women were not supposed to be teaching the law. One of the rabbis said, a man who teaches his daughter the law might just as well make her a prostitute. Not the most flattering analogy. And the daily prayer of most Orthodox male Jews was to thank God that they'd made him a Jew and not a barbarian, free and not a slave, and a man and not a woman. Now, it is true that Greco-Roman society was similar, though women did have more rights in Greco-Roman society, particularly richer women, but it was still the case only Greek and Roman men were citizens. Women couldn't be citizens. When we come to the topic of homosexuality, which will be part of what we're looking at today, there was a bit of a difference there in the sense that it was seen as a phase in Greek society from part of men's growing up in their teens and so on, and then after that they would get married and live a heterosexual life. Rome was different. There was some evidence of homosexuals within Rome, but here you've got a picture of the Orthodox men and women still praying at the Western Wall, and you can see how the men are separated and there's a barrier with the woman on the other side. And that leads to scuffles because the Reform and Liberal Jews, men and women are trying to pray together at the Western Wall. The Orthodox don't like that. So in the descriptive stage, we're looking at Jesus' words and deeds. And in the question we've asked is that with Richard Hayes's stage one was the full exegesis, the full leading out of the relevant text. How do you decide what are the relevant texts? And what we've noticed is that where Hayes, when there are many texts, Hayes tends to choose one passage and make that his dominant one, so that he goes to Matthew chapter 5 for violence or non-violence, because it's about turning the other cheek and so on. Or he goes to the passage we're going to look at today, Mark 10, Matthew 19. Jesus is teaching about divorce. And then all the other passages are read in that light, which raises the question, is this the moral vision of the New Testament, or is this the moral vision of Richard Hayes? And then that's what he does if there are too many to look at. And what if there are not many? Then he tends to use the Old Testament. So in order to answer the question on abortion, he goes down to Exodus 21, to Psalm 139. We looked at that when we were looking at life a couple of weeks ago. And because there's nothing or very little on homosexuality in the New Testament, Richard Hayes goes to Genesis 19, the story of Sodom and so on, and these two key texts in Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 against men lying with men as though they were lying with women. And then he has obviously the same problem over nuclear war and stem cell research. And so this is why I'm saying that this, which is what I'm trying to do, and here I've found you a picture of a trawler. What I wanted to do to deal with this lack of specific text is to drag my net through the New Testament, trawling it and getting them all out on the table, beginning with Jesus and the biblical tradition and the historical tools, and that the biographical genre means doing his deeds as well as his words, and narrative as well as his teachings and so on. And you see a very large net has caught an awful lot of fish in that net. And when they put the net up on the boat, the first thing they're going to do is sort out the fish and by different species and different size and so on. So we've got to learn how to sort out what we've got in our net after we've dragged it through the New Testament. What I want to point out, though, is that both our society today and the church are obsessed with sex and sexual ethics. And this is the thing that's been threatening to split the Anglican Communion. It is really over that the conservative evangelicals within the Episcopal Church left the Episcopal Church and set up the Anglican Church of North America, ACNA, and like to call themselves Anglicans to distinguish themselves from those horrible liberal Episcopalians. But what I want to just point out to you, going back to my net, when I did the drag net through for money, I found 250 verses. In particular, 64 on money, 76 about rich, and we saw last week there were over 50 verses on the poor and poverty and debt and so on. With war and violence, there are over 300 verses. And when we looked at the topic of life, there may not have been much about abortion or stem cells, but there were 200 verses referring to the word life and so on. If you gather all the references to marriage together, you only have 45. And there are 9 references to divorce. So that's only 54. And there are no references to the word sex or sexuality, whether that's hetero or homosexuality, no references whatsoever in the New Testament. There is this other word, porneia, often translated, and we'll come to it in what it means in a bit later, as fornication or harlotry, which comes 49 times in the New Testament. But can you see how, even if you include porneia in it, we've still barely got to 100 verses. And a large number of the connections, the uses of porneia, are to do with spiritual harlotry, particularly in the book of Revelation. In other words, being disloyal to God. There's a few verses which may mean homosexuality or may not, and they are greatly disputed. And if they're not, then there's none. So compared to 250, 300, 200 of the other topics, we barely get to 100, including everything we can do with porneia. And I think that is worth pointing out, that Jesus or God's priorities from the New Testament seem to be very different from those of both our church and our society at present. Richard was a very good friend of mine, and I'm still in grief about his death from cancer a month or two ago. And he does say towards the end of the book something that I think is really important. He says, "Would that the passion presently being expended in the church over the question of homosexuality were devoted instead to urging the wealthy to share with the poor." And we saw last week that that was a very, very clear message. And we also saw last week just how staggeringly rich the real wealthy are getting more and more every year, so that the 1% of the world's population now own half of the world's wealth and so on. And the vast majority of the world's population has to make do with about 1% of the wealth. And Richard points out that some of the most urgent champions of biblical morality on sexual matters become strangely equivocal when the discussion turns to the New Testament's teachings about possessions. And I think Richard is absolutely right to point that out. And he's basically saying, why are we so fixated on this one topic and ignoring the huge amount that there is about wealth and possessions? I mean, in other words, if we were to use Jesus's phrase, you're straining out the gnat and swallowing the camel. But I have to say, in the Moral Vision of the New Testament, he devotes 32 pages to a chapter on divorce and remarriage, and 38 pages to a separate chapter on homosexuality, 18 pages to abortion, on which there are no references in the New Testament, and only 5 pages to wealth and possessions. So even though Richard points out that the champions of biblical morality are not saying much about possession, Richard actually himself devotes 70 pages of the book to issues of marriage and sexuality, 18 to abortion, and 5 to wealth and possessions. And so, I mean, although he's right to point out that the church is out of line with Jesus's and the New Testament's priorities, which are more about non-violence and wealth and poverty, Richard's book, and of course the thing that Richard's book was known of, because he came to the position where his 32 pages on divorce, he was accepting divorce, despite the fact that Jesus does not allow it. Richard argued very strongly for an acceptance of divorce and marriage after divorce. But in his chapter on homosexuality, he was against it, despite the fact that Jesus and the New Testament has so little to say. And in the last year of his life, as he wrote a new book with his son, in which he changed his mind, all his great evangelical conservative friends changed their allegiance and so on, because they saw him as having betrayed it. So that's worth it. Now, this is a very, you won't be able to read all of this, but those who are familiar with my John and Mark courses will know this habit of putting, this is what we call synoptic criticism. Synoptics means just simply to look, optics, sun together. And here we are looking at this story of the Pharisees arguing with Jesus about divorce, and that story is not in Luke, but he does have a single verse. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. And the point that you're looking at, I'm going to come into some of the more detail in a moment, but looking at the whole thing is the yellow shows what is shared material between Mark and Matthew and Luke. And this is what we call the triple tradition. So everything in yellow is triple. The stuff in the green is only in Matthew, the stuff in purple is only in Mark, and the stuff in blue is only in Luke. So that gives you a real sense of what I mean when I talk about the triple tradition. Now, as always, I've sent TJ earlier this morning. TJ, I've sent you the up-to-dated version of the PDF, so you can look at this in a bit more because it is quite difficult to see. And this story hinges on, in Mark's account, Jesus says, "What did Moses command you?" And they say Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal to divorce her. What they're referring to is Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, and I'll read it to you because it's a rather curious passage. "Suppose a man enters into marriage with a woman, but she does not please him because he finds something objectionable about her. And so he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house." That's all the man has to do. All he has to do is write a certificate of dismissal and put her out of his house, and she has to then go off and fend for herself. She then leaves his house and goes off and becomes another man's wife. Suppose the second man dislikes her and again writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand. And in other words, you've got to write it out, put it in your hand, and then send her out of the house. Or the second man who married her perhaps dies. Her first husband, who sent her away, is not permitted to have her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, i.e., by the second man. That would be abhorrent to the Lord, and you shall not bring guilt on the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a possession. So actually, this doesn't really give you instructions about divorce. It doesn't tell you what the grounds are or anything. It just refers to if she doesn't please him and something objectionable. And the really key bit is that if the first guy wants her back, he can't have her because she's been defiled. And this would be abhorrent to the land. And so that's the passage that the Pharisees are referring to. They're saying that Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce, put it in a woman's hand, and send her out of the house. Now, the question obviously is, what does it mean she doesn't please him, or because he finds something objectionable about her? Shammai, who was the leader of the conservative faction, said that something objectionable means infidelity. That was all he would accept. That was all that was objectionable. Anything else you couldn't get divorced for. Hillel, who was the leader of the liberal faction, said, well, if she burns the breakfast or the toast, or if she doesn't please him. So if he just finds another woman more attractive, that's good enough as well. And so this was a live debate in the first century between the conservatives and the liberals about the grounds for divorce. And what they're doing is coming to Jesus as a rabbi, as a teacher, and asking which side does he agree with? Does he agree with the conservatives, that it's only about infidelity, or does he side with the liberals? The man can just do it for anything he likes. And therefore, there's very little actual ground for the divorce here. The purpose of that passage is about not being allowed to take the first wife back. And the reason is would seem to us curious today. The reason is that this would be abhorrent to the land. Now that makes no sense to us as to why the land would object to this. And therefore you wouldn't get good crops and things like that. And so that's a good example of cultural relativism. And clearly it was an important issue for not to upset the land in the Hebrew scriptures, but it was not something that we would take into account today in our different cultures. And what Jesus is doing is to say, no, look, never mind Deuteronomy 24. Let's go back to Genesis 1 and 2. In the beginning, he says, God made male and female and made them one flesh. And in Genesis 1, 26 to 27, the very first commandment that God gives to the human race, he made them male and female. And it's very interesting that it says that it uses a word for a non-gender specific human being. And so God created the human being, Male and female he created them and put them in the image of God. So the image of God is seen in the union of the two, and he blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and multiply." And in Genesis 2:24, after the story of the creation of the earth creature, the Adam from the Adamah, the ground, and giving the breath of life, Eve, into the earth creature. And so what Jesus says in Mark 10 and the parallel in Matthew 19, from the beginning God made them male and female. For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate. And that, of course, has gone into our marriage liturgies. And so Jesus was basically saying, I'm not going to get into your argument about Deuteronomy 24. I'm taking you right back to the original intention in Genesis. In Mark's account, Jesus uses Moses' command to refer to Genesis chapter 1. And the Pharisees shift it from commandment to Moses allowed us in Deuteronomy 24. In Matthew, it's the other way round. The Pharisees say that Deuteronomy 24 is Moses' command. And Jesus says, no, Moses allowed you. And Matthew, whereas in Mark's account, there is no exception. You can't have divorce, period, says Jesus. Matthew accepts Shammai's exception, except for porneia. And so Matthew inserts in the question that the Pharisees asked Jesus, can a man divorce for any cause? And so that's it's really asking him to get involved in the discussion about the grounds for divorce. And it has, except for porneia, and whoever marries another commits adultery against her. And very often you'll find in other English translations, Matthew is translated as, except for adultery. But porneia is not adultery. It's often translated as adultery, but that's a completely different word, moichata. There are 50 verses containing porneia in the New Testament, 19 of which are in Revelation. And, I mean, the key is the first four letters, porn. A porne is a prostitute. A pornon is a pimp, a brothel keeper. A porneon is a brothel. And a porne is often translated as whores or harlots and so on. So it clearly refers to specifically the issue of sex for and involving money. In the Greek Old Testament, it often uses the porne word for harlots and whores, referring to Israel's spiritual harlotry. And we have that in Hosea, where he's commanded to go and marry a harlot or a prostitute to illustrate how Israel has committed spiritual harlotry. And that is the 19 references in the book of Revelation are nearly all about people who have turned their back on God. It's about spiritual harlotry. The English word that is sometimes used to translate porneia in the King James Bible is this word fornication. And that's a very common word, but I keep asking people, what do they think fornication means? And they will usually tell me it's about premarital sex or extramarital sex. And that's been the main teaching, particularly of the more traditional or conservative side of the church for a very long time. Actually, fornix, if you look it up, fornix is the Latin word for an arch. And a fornicatrix was somebody who plied her trade underneath the arches. Now, this isn't a railway viaduct in Rome at the time. It means the aqueduct. And underneath the aqueduct is where you would go if you wanted to find a woman for sex. And all the fornic words, fornicator is somebody who goes to the arches, and somebody else who runs the business underneath the arches and so on. And so the English word fornication in the King James Bible, like the Greek word porneia, is all to do with prostitutes and brothels. It's not actually the use that we've all been taught it, and certainly not what I was taught when I was 18 or 19 about, keep your hands off your girlfriend kind of thing. It's about being under the arches, going to brothels and so on. The RSV says except for unchastity, for porneia, and the NRSV, and the RSV also used it for immorality, was another translation it uses, and the NRSV translates it as sexual immorality. So we have a real problem with the English translations, which are obscuring what the word means. And having looked at them, literally every single instance of it, porneia is not used for premarital sex or extramarital sex, and it certainly does not refer to loving equal sex in a loving equal relationship. And yet that's been the interpretation of it with the word fornication, which may well have been understood in 1611 in Jacobean language, that they knew that meant a form of prostitution and so on. But by the 18th and 19th and certainly the 20th century, when I was being a young Christian and being taught what it meant, fornication had completely changed its meaning. And the marriage passage is primarily about a divorce. And the interesting there is that Jesus' teaching is more hardline than any conservative rabbi. Shammai at least allowed an exception. I find it particularly odd that this passage is currently being used by tending to be more conservative and evangelicals as part of their anti-gay rhetoric. And yet they accept divorce. And the passage explicitly forbids divorce and has nothing to say about homosexuality. What we do find is that defilement comes out of the heart. Remember, the Deuteronomy said that the woman had been defiled by marrying somebody else. And it comes out of the heart. And there's a long list of evil things like gluttony and anger and envy and so on that come out of the heart. And in that list, it includes porneia and moichei. So we can see that porneia is distinguished from adultery. So it's prostitutes, brothels, or whatever, and adulteries. And the point is that these are thoughts and ideas of the mind and the heart. It's got nothing to do with bodily functions or concerns like physical purity. And we also have this old passage where the Sadducees, who don't believe in the resurrection, come up with the 7 brides, or one bride for 7 brothers. If this woman who gets married to each of 7 brothers in turn, and then they all die on her, and he says, whose wife will she be in heaven, in the resurrection? And he says, marriage is for this world only. And if you think of all the stuff that is very, very common, and I'm sure if you went out and looked around your graveyard and so on, the whole idea that husband and wife are reunited in death is something very different from what Jesus is saying, that the angels do not give or take in marriage, and will be like the angels, and marriage is simply for this world, which again suggests that this is a much less important part of Jesus' teaching. And then we come on to his deeds and his actions and his pastoral example, and we see that, I used to find it very odd, particularly when some of the televangelists and conservative Americans would talk about Jesus and family values. Because in Mark chapter 3, Mary and his brothers obviously feel that Jesus is, the word they use is beside himself. I mean, he's gone out on this complete limb, and they go looking for him, and they can't even get through the crowd. And the story, he's told that his mother is there. Now, if you're a good Jewish boy and your mother is at the door asking to see you, you go and see her. Otherwise, you'll get a clip round the ear. But Jesus says, this is my mother and my brothers, and points at the people. I mean, that's a complete rejection. That would be hugely offensive in the ancient world. And Peter points out he's left everything, including his family and his lands and his business, for Jesus. And when somebody asks Jesus about, he wants to follow them, but he has to bury his father first, Jesus tells them, leave the dead to bury the dead. So having been offensive about his mother, he's now offensive about the duty to your father, and says there's no time to say farewell to the family. So there's a very strong suggestion there that what we call family values are certainly not something that Jesus shared. He was regularly accused of being the friend of sinners. There's a very complicated story about him being anointed by a woman, and trying to work out who it was who did the anointing, where she did the anointing, where she actually anointed him, on his head or his feet, and why did she do it, and was it tears or was it ointment, and his acceptance of her. And whoever it was, it's not Mary Magdalene, as in Jesus Christ Superstar. And so that's quite a complicated passage, that. And those who did my Gospels course know we spent a little bit of time on that. We also have a Syro-Phoenician woman. This means somebody from Lebanon, when Jesus is up in Tyre and Sidon, quite close to modern Beirut. And this woman comes and wants him to heal her sick daughter. And Jesus says it's not right to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. And that is a Jewish way of describing the Gentiles as dogs. And so Jesus is getting close to calling this woman a bitch. And her response is to say that if the children don't want the food, the dogs can still have the scraps under the table. And Jesus turns around and says, well, that's a brilliant response. Yes, you've got your prayer, your daughter as well. And so did Jesus intend it to go that way, or does she somehow change his attitude towards the Gentiles? We have the woman with the flow of blood, which means that she's been menstruating for 12 years. And that makes her impure, because if you have a leaking bodily fluids, that makes you impure. You mustn't touch anybody, you can't go to synagogue, and so on. And while Jesus is on his way to see the daughter of the synagogue leader, Jairus, this woman with the flow of blood comes and touches Jesus. Now that would make him impure and mean that he couldn't go and heal Jairus' daughter. And yet he stops to heal her. Jairus is going up the wall. And what actually happened, far from her making him impure, his purity heals her. And then he goes on to also to save the Jairus' daughter, who interestingly is 12 years old, and the woman had the flow of blood for 12 years. And we have frequent mentions of women followers, especially at the cross and at the tomb, when the men have all gone away. We have a list of named disciples, women disciples, in Luke 8. And when Martha says to Jesus, why is Mary sitting at your feet like a man with a rabbi? Tell her to come and help me in the kitchen. Jesus affirms Mary's choice to sit at his feet. So to sum up that, we've been using this idea of a best line fit, like tracing the Milky Way and so on, that Jesus is giving us a direction of travel. And Jesus' preaching of the kingdom is often a very hard line. His words are very, very hard line and demanding. We saw that in money and in violence, turning the other cheek, giving away everything. And now we're seeing a very, very hard line, more conservative than the most conservative, no divorce whatsoever, rejection of family values. It certainly was would have been a challenge to the contemporary morality of his own day, as it is to ours. But the importance of my biographical approach, and why I keep coming back to my stuff on biography, is that if that's all you do is look at his words, then Jesus' preaching is very, very, very conservative and very, very hard line on money, violence, and on marriage and sexuality. But we also saw the way in which Jesus accepted in his followers tax collectors, and was happy to go to rich people's houses to discuss theology, that he had some terrorists or freedom fighters, depending on how you want to describe them, among his disciples. And here we see that he is living out this very ascetic teaching. He is himself a single person, which was, again, would have been very strange for a rabbi, particularly in his late 20s, 30. Probably didn't get married because Joseph died just at the time that he should have been getting his teenage son, Jesus, a bride. He lives this ascetic lifestyle, but he's constantly surrounded by women and accepts sexual sinners among his disciples and followers, so that he's called a drunkard and a friend of sinners. And so there is this contrast that comes out of my biographical approach between his hard teaching on the one hand and his open and inclusive pastoral practice on the other. So I've spent quite a bit of time in some detail on that. We're now going to have to move through the other stuff a bit more quickly, but again, you will have it on your sheet to look at. When we come to the double tradition, the stuff that's in Matthew and Luke but not in Mark, we have this saying, which I have up in yellow, that if you divorce your wife and marries another, they're committing adultery. And interestingly, and we've got the same thing in Matthew 5, about it was said that whoever divorces, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you, anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of, and this is the RSV, unchastity, when he's actually porneia, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Notice it's all done from the man's point of view, as in also in Luke 16, anybody who divorces a wife is committing adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced, he's committing adultery. Mark is much more equal in this matter. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, in Jewish society, women couldn't divorce their husband. That's a Greco-Roman. So that tells us something about Mark's community, Mark's church, being less Jewish and more Greco-Roman, where there's more of that equality around. And then we have, if we come to the single tradition, in Matthew we have the way in which Jesus intensifies not committing adultery to lustful looks. You've heard it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you, anybody who looks at a woman with lust has committed adultery in his heart. And then we saw the same thing with the violence, if you remember. It was said to you, do not kill. In other words, he's redefining the commandments. But if you have anger, that's just as bad, says Jesus. And now it's saying it's not enough just not to commit adultery. You shouldn't be lusting after a woman. And that leads us into this bizarre saying about plucking out your right eye or chopping off your right hand or your leg or whatever and throwing it away. And we looked at that verse earlier in the course, and I showed you this rather weird, slightly disturbing photograph, a picture I found on a televangelist kind of website. And I asked the question, here is a clear command of Jesus telling us to pluck out our eyes and chop off our hands and feet. We don't do it. Also, only in Matthew, we have this rather strange story about eunuchs for the kingdom. The disciples say, well, look, if you're right about this, if you're taking this hard line, and it's best not to get married. And Jesus says to them, not everyone can accept this teaching, only those to whom it's given. There are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. In other words, there are people without men without genitalia who are incapable of intercourse from birth. There are others who have been castrated, that have been habits when you take prisoners of war. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. In other words, those who have decided to stay single for the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. Now, this has had an enormous tradition. Origen supposedly self-castrated himself in a literal reading of that command. And it is still one of the main justifications for priestly celibacy in the Roman Catholic tradition. If you want to serve God in the kingdom of heaven, you have to make yourself a eunuch, not necessarily in the way that Origen did, self-mutilation, but in remaining priestly celibate. So it is usually having a huge impact. In Luke, he tones down the comments about the mother and the family in Mark chapter 3, and he completely omits the divorce story. We have the one little saying in chapter 16, and I asked the question, well, why is he toning it down? Why is he omitting the divorce pericope? And we have to recognize that Luke has a much more positive attitude to women generally. We've got the great focus on women like Mary's songs in chapter 1, including the Magnificat. We've got women disciples, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, and Susanna in chapter 8. Mary's allowed to sit at Jesus' feet and listen like a man. There are a lot more healings and ministry to women in Luke's gospel. And Luke has this tendency to have male-female pairings. So we begin with Elizabeth with Zechariah in chapter 1. And when we go to in the temple, it's Anna with Simeon. Or there's the widow of Zarephath with Naaman. Or when we come to the parables, there's the man with the lost sheep and the woman with the lost coin. So Luke seems to be very definitely trying to sort of even it up and have women as often as he has men. In John, we also see Jesus crossing the gender and racial divide. He speaks to this Samaritan woman at the well. So a man shouldn't be speaking to a woman in public like that. It's also a different race. It's the Samaritans and Jews who don't talk to one another, and different creed. And she is the one he says has had many men and offers her living or running water. And she says, well, where do you get the bucket from for that? And then in John chapter 8, we have the story of the woman taken in the very act of adultery, to which my answer is, well, where is the man? It takes two to be committing adultery. When they bring the woman, have they let the man go? Which sounds like it's a bit of a setup. And he bends down and writes in the earth. And the question is, what is he writing in the earth? And some traditions say he's writing down their sins. Others say he's writing down, don't bear false witness. And I chose this wonderful painting of Christ and the Adulteress by Lorenzo Lotto from the early 1500s. In the bigger painting, there are a lot of pointing fingers. And I love the way in which Jesus is holding up his hand in front of the woman to kind of protect her. And I thought that was a wonderful image of what I was trying to say throughout imitating Jesus. And in Bethany, of course, we have Jesus' love for Mary and Martha, and Lazarus and his grief and his anger at Lazarus's death. Mary of Bethany anointing him in John chapter 12, and Jesus defending her against Judas's accusation. In the Acts of the Apostles, as we begin to move in through the rest of the New Testament, the Apostolic Council says, no, you don't have to be circumcised. You don't have to keep the law. All you have to do is abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from eating anything with blood in it, and from what is strangled, and abstain from, and again the English translation says fornication, but it's porneia. And there's all these women very active in ministry throughout the book of Acts. Women in prayer with the disciples. We have the stories about Dorcas or Tabitha, Mary, mother of John, Lydia opening her home in Philippi, Priscilla, who's clearly the theologian in the teaching her husband Aquila in Corinth. Now, Paul has a reputation of being anti-women and anti-sex. You know Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's programs in the 1960s on the BBC, not only but also they did this wonderful sort of parody of a Pauline letter. Dear friends, wherever, whatever you're doing, stop enjoying yourself. God is about. Cover yourself with ashes, love, Paul. But the main section is Paul's debate with the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 5-7. And in 1 Corinthians chapters 1-6, he deals with the various concerns reported to him that he's heard, like the different groups within the church, the factions, and sexual immorality. It's like hearing one side of a telephone conversation. You know, if you're in a bus or a tube or something like that, and you hear somebody on the phone and you hear what their answer is, and you think, my goodness me, if that was the answer, what's the question? And then in chapter 7, he says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, which starts the whole new section. In other words, he's had a letter from the Corinthians asking him a whole bunch of questions. And this is the issue about contingency. We only know about these things because the Corinthians asked him in the questions. And if you look at the list, it's about marriage in chapter 7, it's about food to idols in chapter 8, it's about baptism in chapter 10, it's about the Eucharist in chapter 11, it's about worship and spiritual gifts in 12-15, and the resurrection in 15. So this is an incredible long list, and we wouldn't have any of that material if it wasn't that Paul says to them, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. But the problem is that Oh, well, yeah, we'll come back to that in just a minute. As I've said, the main section here is Paul's debate with the Corinthians in 1 Corinthians 5 to 7, where we have his statement about there is no Jew or Greek, slave or free, male or female. It is repeated regularly about abstaining from immorality, porneia. We have the, I think these slides must be out of order. Let me just jump over to the, yeah. Here, this is what I was going to say, is that it's actually reported among you that there's sexual immorality of a kind not even found among the pagans. A man is living with his father's wife. He's upset by the damage done by this to preaching the gospel. And I wrote in my letter not to associate with pornois, meaning the immoral of this world, as the English's translation. Don't associate with anybody who names the name of a brother who is a pornos, or greedy, or idolater, reviler, drunkard, and so on. Don't even eat with them. And of course, they would have been part of trade guilds, having meetings and dinners, hence the point there in verse 10 about not eating them, and the meat being sold from the back of the temple, food from idols, and he forbids them taking fellow Christians to court. And in 1 Corinthians 6, 9 to 11, he has a vice list of wrongdoers, which we're going to come to in a moment. And the Christians at Corinth have divided between the Greek dualism, antagonism to the body, between ascetics on the one hand and libertines on the other. Those who think they've got freedom from the law and are yet avoiding the accusation of anything goes. And Paul makes it very clear, shun porneia. Every sin the person commits is outside the body, but the pornuon, the person who's committing porneia, is sinning against the body, and your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit. And the background here is, of course, of ritual and casual prostitution. In Corinth, if you went to the temple of Aphrodite, the way you worshipped Aphrodite, or Venus was her Roman name, of course, you did that by having sex with one of the priestesses. So it was a kind of ritual prostitution as a way of worshipping Aphrodite. And of old, Greek Corinth had a very notorious reputation. It had two harbours, and like all harbour cities, therefore it had a strong red light district, except the red light district was a temple to Aphrodite. The Roman city of Corinth is different, but if you look at the frescoes in Pompeii, you can certainly see plenty of sex going on. And this is the bit I was saying. 1 Corinthians 7:1 says, concerning the matters about which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. In the NRSV, it is noticeable that it's in inverted commas. It is well for a man not to touch a woman. In other words, concerning the matters about which you wrote, he is quoting from their letter. They are the ones who are saying it is well for a man not to touch a woman, and he then disagrees with them and gives them instructions about married couples, unmarried people, widows, and so on. The King James version and the older versions do not have those inverted commas. Now, concerning that which you wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman, which makes it sound as though it is Paul who's saying that, rather than Paul quoting the Corinthians saying it, and then he disagrees with them. And the reason why they're saying it is these two reactions. The sexually liberated ones who say, we're free from the law so we can do what they like with the body, because the body's not important. And then the others who have a more ascetic life of fasting and celibacy and so on, are saying, again, the body's not important, so we can mortify the body. And 1 Corinthians 7 is not marked as a quote in the King James Bible. But Paul disagrees and says because of porneia, everybody should have their own wife and husband, and even if they want to fast from sex in order to pray, he suggests you should only do it for a set time and then come back together. There's no evidence of Paul taking a hard line of sexual abstinence, but states the importance of conjugal rights, and in a very strongly patriarchal male-led society, he does it with a strong sense of mutuality. He points out he has a personal preference for the single state, but varies marriage. He wishes everybody was like him so they could concentrate on serving God. And it's interesting, he says that his state is a charisma, a charismatic gift, suggesting that celibacy is not a choice, but a charism from God. and of course enforced celibacy, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church, upon anyone who wants to be a priest, they may not have received the gift, the charisma of celibacy. But Paul suggests one person has one sort of gift and another person has a different sort of gift. Some are like him, have the gift of celibacy, others have the gift of marriage. And he repeats Jesus' command, one of the rare times when you actually get him quoting Jesus, that you can't have divorce and no remarriage, and he reflects the Markan idea that men and women do divorce. And then he gives a comment saying, now I don't have a word from the Lord about this, but this is my idea, and that he's against divorce, but does permit it for an unbelieving partner. If the husband converts, she shouldn't divorce him, because the holiness is transmitted as the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife. His key point is to stay in the state in which you are called. Doesn't matter what state you're in, don't be distracted. If you were a slave, stay a slave. If you were free, stay free. If you were married, stay married. If you are not married, stay single, and so on. He does allow for second marriage for widows after the husband's death, but his preference is to stay single. And he says, I have the Spirit of God. So what we see here is Paul is aware of this tradition of Jesus' teaching, but is trying to apply it in one of the most difficult cities in the empire, where he permits marriage and in some cases divorce. Thinks it might be better if they all remain single like him, but that's his particular charism, and they might not find it right for them. There are lots of vice lists, which is a typical feature in ancient writings, where he just has a long list of things. And there are, when I added them all up, there are 62 different vices that appear in all these vice lists. Which porneia is the most frequent, but it occurs 9 times in the 62. It's a very wide range, and the same is true of the works of the flesh. And if you analyze the list, 49 of them are about your attitudes towards other people, being proud, hating, heartless, evil passions, bitter and selfish, and so on, attacking one another, back to Paul's concern about labels. So that's a third of them about how you treat other people. 27 of them, nearly a fifth of them, are spiritual vices, being godless or faithless or idolatrous, impurity, blasphemy, and so on. Equally, almost an equal number is for actual crimes: greed, theft, being evil and unjust, being lawless, murder, enslaving people, perjuring, and so on. And 19 of them, 13%, are about speech: lying, slander, gossip, foolish, and so on. And only 10% are about specific behavior actions. Some refer to drink, drugs, and carousing, arguing, gossiping, brutes being out of control, or being disobedient. Out of that, the whole total, only 9% are actually to do with the issues of sexuality, 9 of which are to do with porn, and maybe 2 or 3 are connected with homosexuals, and 1 reference to adultery. So again, we can see that in Paul's main concern of vices, sexual sin is actually a very minor fact, and yet people keep quoting these passages, so that in 1 Corinthians 6 it says, neither pornoi, nor moikoi, nor malakoi, nor arsenokoitai. So that's pornoi, we've just said, people to do with porn. Moikoi are adulterers. Malakos means soft. It's a word meaning softies. And we don't know what softies were. It is assumed that this might have been a colloquialism for effeminate men. And then arsenokoitai are men who lie with other men. So that's quite difficult to translate those words. What is interesting is the English translators translate them by words like male prostitutes, sodomites, effeminates, perverts. And most of the vice lists don't include these 2 terms at all. And so we have 149 instances of vices, but only 3 possible, at most, instances of homosexuality. And so, once again, we see that this, often in today's debate, that verse 1 Corinthians 6:9 is quoted by lots of heterosexuals are saying we can't have homosexuals on, but who are perfectly happy with all the greed and envy and so on that's going on. And in Romans 1, we have this vice list of the people who refuse to worship God, which includes homosexual behavior. But it then goes on to people who are malice, deceivers, slanderers, heartless, crafty, foolish, without brains, literally, and those who are disobedient to their parents. And he says that all of these are equally deserving of death. But nobody today is seriously advocating the death penalty for disobedient children. And yet, out of that chapter, the one thing that gets picked up on is against homosexual behavior. It doesn't say anything about being deceiving, slandering, heartless, foolish, and so on. And my point there is, it's used as though only homosexuals will not inherit the kingdom, but ignoring all the others. And Paul is quite clear that everybody has universal sinfulness. All have sinned and fallen short. We've seen his example of him as a single person. We've seen that he has some comments about women in headship and being silent in church. But he is the one who says there's neither Jew nor Greek, neither slave nor free. And he has lots of women co-workers, Euodia, Syntyche, Chloe, Phoebe. And probably he refers to a couple, Andronicus and Junia, my relatives, who are prominent among the apostles, which suggests that Junia is a female name, is a woman apostle. It could possibly be the male name, but in that case we have a same-sex couple, Andronicus and Junius. But it's much more likely that Paul is calling a woman an apostle. And in the rest of the New Testament, we see how this follows through again. Second marriage is allowed for widows. A bishop or a deacon has to be a husband of only one wife. And in Revelation, it has 40% of the uses of porn words in the New Testament, but they all refer to spiritual infidelity as harlots. So there's a general ideal of one flesh, one man, one woman for keeps. No divorce is asserted by Jesus in Mark and in Luke and in 1 Corinthians 6. And homosexuality is rare in the New Testament if it mentioned at all, and it's not mentioned by Jesus at all. And so back to our canonical direction of travel, Jesus is a single ascetic. He's in favor of permanent marriage and a general sense that sexual issues rank least on his agenda, and this runs through the rest of the New Testament, not being porneia. But the church has been obsessed with sex and ignored the rest of his teachings. Now, in terms of the four genres, you're familiar with that. You can see how it goes. We have the rules and the commands against divorce and the prohibition of porneia, but we also have this command to pluck out our eyes and cut off our hands, which we don't follow. We have the principles of one flesh and the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. We have the example of Jesus as being a single rabbi, Paul's example of being happy as a celibate. We have the example of Peter, who has a wife. And if we go through the symbolic biblical worldview of creation, incarnation, atonement, we can see the way in which marriage and sexuality is created by God, is something that is good, is redeemed by Jesus along with everything else through the incarnation and his atonement and so on. And the fact that the answer to the Sadducees is that there is no marriage in heaven, and the big picture at the end of Revelation as the church, as the bride of Christ. So, to sum it all up, Jesus reaffirms Genesis' one flesh as permanent, lifelong, heterosexual, exclusive relation for sex and marriage, even against the conservatives. There is clear opposition to porneia, whatever that means, and Jesus lives it out in his own ascetic single lifestyle while accepting sexual sinners in his group along with others, so that he even gets a bad name for keeping company with them. We can see how Matthew and Paul try to apply Jesus' hardline teaching to practical issues about sex and marriage in their congregations, that Luke is particularly sympathetic to women, clear antagonism to porneia across all these writers, and homosexuality is a very minor issue in the vice list, if at all. We've got the commands against porneia, we've got the principle of one flesh, Jesus and Paul's examples, and the overall biblical worldview. And so I want to suggest the church's traditional negativity to sex doesn't reflect a biblical worldview. And we have the current inconsistency over the treatment of women, particularly in ministry and different approaches, where we accept divorce, and certainly within the church, but not homosexuality. And so this following Jesus in this way gives us some content but not all the answers. And that's where we now have to look at the practical issues, as we've been doing all the way through, and how has the church followed the ethic. Again, I'm suggesting this is somewhere where you need to get together in a community to look at these verses together, listening to other voices. And therefore, that's where you'll have to discuss how consistent are we in applying Jesus and the New Testament teaching about sexual morality, and particularly how we accept divorce or opposed to homosexuality, at least in the Church of England. It's different in the Episcopal Church. I find it very interesting that marriage after divorce was, and even in my time, we could not be ordained if you were like that. And yet the Church of England came into being because Henry VIII wanted to divorce his wife. And a word of warning, the Lambeth Conference condemned contraception in 1908 and then overwhelmingly accepted it in 1930. And so the issue about resolutions of the Lambeth Conference. So this affects the issues about premarital sex and cohabitation in our contemporary world. The ordination of divorcees, which is now allowed in the Church of England, but only by a legal faculty. And we only have 1 or 2 bishops who are divorced are being allowed to be consecrated bishop. We have all the issues about women and the battles over women's ordination as deacons and priests and then as bishops. The current target is to have parity among the bishops in the Church of England by 2030. The debate is all about transgender people, and we have the Church of England is tearing itself apart over the blessings of civil partnerships. We're not allowed to have same-sex marriage in the church, nor are priests really allowed to be ordained or consecrated as bishop. But the question comes back to, why do we pick one of these few verses? I love this tattoo. Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20 forbid homosexuality. And here's a guy who's got it tattooed without knowing that in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 28, in between those two verses, says that it's also an abomination to have a tattoo. And so it's the same word as being there's an abomination of homosexuality in 18 and 20, and having a tattoo is an equally abomination, and yet he has a tattoo of it. And so where does that help us with all of our various kind of debates? And I'm concluding by saying, as we've said all the way through, there's an overall coherence of Jesus' teaching, but I keep asking the question about why are these certain hot button issues, like abortion, when we're looking at the life question, or like homosexuality, become the touchstone, the acid test of so-called biblical orthodoxy, when we ignore the much larger and clearer errors that we found about the use of non-violence and money not being allowed. And I'm wanting to suggest if this fourfold method provides us with some ethical material to work with and helps us to form the inclusive communities of discussion. And again, plug for the books. So I've slightly overrun the hour. TJ, would you like to? Is there anybody who'd like to ask any questions from the group? We've got fewer online this week, but there may be that they want to ask them. But let's see where we are in the room, and I will stop the share. So there you should now be able to.
Thank you. Do we have any questions in the room? Not seeing any in the room at the moment. Or do we have any questions online?
Yes.
David?
Hello, I'm David from Exeter. I'd like you to speculate. We have this mismatch between the priorities of the Old Testament and the priorities generally found in church teaching. Why?
Well, you've invited me to speculate, which is something that I'm cautious about doing. It's very easy to avoid the main thrust that we have in Jesus' teachings and so on by picking on a minority. We also see the way in which contemporary society changes it. So Henry VIII gets divorced, that's okay, but then the Church of England doesn't like it, and then 18th, 19th, 20th century, and then in the last 2 or 3 decades, it's become much, much more acceptable in society, and therefore much more, the pressure was on the church to change. And we have the bizarre situation in England at the moment with the Church of England having exemption from the equalities legislation of the English Parliament. And I don't know how much longer it can go on claiming to be the Church of England when it has to have an exemption. I mean, I'm just not, even if I wanted to, I am not allowed to do, certainly can't do gay marriage. Legally, it wouldn't be allowed to. Whereas in the Episcopal Church, it's now been put on an equal kind of footing. So I think it's easier to avoid the challenge that affects 90% of us by picking on the 10%.
Thank you. Yes, interesting.
Dennis?
Yeah, I just you started off talking about remarrying the second time from Deuteronomy being a crime against the land. Could you just say briefly what's the scholarly opinion on how that was so? Why against the land?
Well, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, so I can't say. But what I'm pointing out is that the argument is that I think it's part and parcel of their obsession with purity. So you're not allowed, for instance, to mix 2 different types of yarn in a garment. So this is a polyester cotton shirt. That is specifically against the Old Testament. You're not allowed to mix. You weren't allowed to sow 2 different sorts of seeds in the same field, and so there's that sort of suggestion that the land itself needs some kind of purity, and clearly it's got something to do with the idea that if you allowed this to happen, you'd have bad crops and so on. But that's why I pointed out it is something to do with the culture of the day, and that makes it very difficult for us to take Deuteronomy 24 in terms of giving us any kind of ideas about grounds for divorce. And even those provisions date from the 6th, 7th century BC. By the 1st century, Jesus' time, they're debating about what this certificate means and how you go about doing it and what the grounds are and so on. So even within 700 years, it was being a focus of major debate in Jesus' day, and 2,000 years later, even more so.
So you don't think it was a problem of muddling the entitlements to the land as a result of having two spouses or something?
So, yeah, it's something along those sorts of lines, I would guess.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody in the room, TJ?
I'm not seeing any hands at the moment, no. So I think that might be all of our questions.
So let me ask. I can talk at you for an hour next week, but I was thinking this would be a good opportunity for people to come with their reflections and their questions. I'll do a summary kind of issue and try to pull this together. But maybe people could actually think back. I've given you all the slides, and TJ, I've sent you the slides after I tweaked them today. So you've got the up-to-date slides that were in an email, which I'm hoping you've received. During church, let me know if you haven't received it. Look back over the sheets from the previous weeks, and come, prepared to ask questions or discuss and debate next week.
Great. Thank you so much, Richard. We appreciate it.
God bless everyone. Thank you. And as you can see, I have made it safely back to Exeter. I landed at 10 or 11 o'clock this morning, having been on a plane all night. Got back to here, and I need to go to bed now.
Well, you get some good rest. We'll see you next week.
All right, thanks.
Well.